Okay, then we can begin our session. Thank you all. Now we must begin with Leonardo Bonilla. So the floor is yours, Leonardo.
Okay, thank you for joining this session. There's a lot of good sessions going on, so I'm glad you're here. Let me just put it on full screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
So this is joint work with Juan Sebastián Muñoz, who's now at ESEG in Paris, and this is a paper about trade and labor market in a developing country. So when you think about, and this whole session is about that, so you are probably aware of the literature. When you think about trade and labor markets, you're usually thinking about developed countries. Most of the literature has focused on the US and some European countries, and they usually think about the China effect, right? So what happens when the US is suddenly exposed to all these imports from lower income countries with lower wages and these very hard to compete products coming into the economy. So most of the historic and the recent literature has focused on this specific case. Then there's some papers thinking about the developing world, and you have some papers for Brazil and some new papers coming out now on other developing countries thinking about what's the effect of trade in developing countries when they open their economy to trade. And in these cases, what you're going to see is very heterogeneous effects. And in some cases, it's going to affect employment and wages, and in others, it isn't. And when you do find some results, like in the Brazilian case, you're going to say that it's probably because of this imperfect labor mobility within the country. So regions that were more exposed to trade should have seen people living actually to regions that were less exposed, but this didn't happen. And so this the logic explaining these negative impacts is that people are not adjusting to these shocks as we would have expected as economists. And then you see these kinds of sentences that jobs that should be offered to Brazilians are being delivered to Chinese, Korean, Indians, and so on and so forth. But these papers, once again, are thinking about what happens when you open trade to low-income countries. Even in the Brazilian case, they were mostly thinking about the China effect, right? Well, I have Korea in that list, but the paper was mostly thinking about what happened with the China effect in Brazil. Then the most recent papers tend to think about net losses, and basically what has been highlighted in most recent papers is that there are different mechanisms. It's not just import competition. So we have lower tariffs for shoes, so what happens to shoemakers, right? But there are different mechanisms through which trade can affect labor markets, and they're going to think about more the general equilibrium effects of these. So this paper is gonna try to fill into this literature in two ways. First, is gonna assess what happens in a low-income country, and we're gonna basically be talking about Colombia, when there's a sudden trade shock with a high-income country, which is a rare case. You usually think about the China effect, right? But so what we're going to do in this paper is try to assess what happened to Colombia when it really increased trade and particularly imports from the US. And this is a really different scenario from previous studies, because we're thinking about what happens when you're going to import more goods from a rich country, right, with higher wages. So you shouldn't necessarily expect the same effects that you would see in other papers where you're studying China effect, for example. And the second thing that we're going to focus on is that we're going to study the usual import competition effects. So, tariffs on goods and what happens to the sectors that were producing those goods, right? That's the usual approach, but we're also going to try to measure the effects of intermediary inputs. And this is a big issue, because when you open your economy and you reduce tariffs, you're going to have two effects, basically two large effects. On the one hand, you're going to have cheaper products coming from abroad. They're going to be competing for your market. So if you're producing shoes and you're suddenly getting all these cheap Chinese shoes in your market, you might face trouble, right? But the other thing is that your inputs are also going to be are potentially cheaper if you open your economy, and that could affect your output and your market as a whole, because you're getting cheaper inputs. And that's the second channel we're going to focus on in this paper. So the question, the research question is going to be how does the penetration of goods from high wage countries affect the labor market of emerging economies? And we're going to focus on the case of Colombia and these trade deals that took place in the last decade with the US. So we had basically two exogenous shocks to tariffs. The first one was in 2010, and it was a unilateral reduction of import tariffs for all countries, not just the US, but all countries. And the second one was the free trade agreement between Colombia and the US, which also, it further reduced the tariffs Colombia charges Colombia has for US goods. And there was some reduction in the tariffs from the US to Colombia, but as we will see, it didn't really affect the exports from Colombia to the US. It was just the other way around. And we're going to compete these two measures of trade shocks, the competition one, which is basically the tariffs for the goods that are produced in your sector, and then the input shock, which is the tariffs of the inputs, of the typical inputs of your sector, of your industry. And then we're going to explore some heterogeneity by skills and accessibility, thinking about how heterogeneous roads and market access is in Colombia. And finally, we're going to see some reallocation effects. We're going to try to think about some reallocation effects. So some preview of our results, our main results. So we have 5 big results in this paper. First, the input competition matters, and it actually decreases employment, as in most of this literature, but we also find a positive and significant effect for the inputs mechanism, and it is as large as the input competition coefficients that we were estimating. We cannot say that they are really offsetting each other, because this is not a general equilibrium framework, but the magnitude of the effects is quite similar, actually. The second point is that there is large heterogeneity by sectors, and we see, for instance, important job losses in manufacturing and gains in the service sector, which somehow indicates that trade has accelerated this long-term trend of reallocation between manufacturing to service sector in Colombia. We see some wage adjustment, but only in the informal sector, which could be a sign of wage rigidities in the formal sector, which exist and are rather large in the Colombian labor market. We see some heterogeneous effects by education. Basically, we only find some wage losses in high-skilled workers, which could also be related to rigidities in the labor market for low-skilled workers. And then finally, we see some heterogeneity by accessibility, where basically the largest impacts are concentrated in less accessible areas of the country. So let's go back to the background and think a little bit about these 2 reforms that I was telling you about. So the first one is a unilateral decrease of tariffs that Colombia did in 2010. It was hard to anticipate. It was a presidential decree, and the main intention of this reform was to get cheaper inputs for industries. And as you can see here in the left, there were rather big tariff cuts in manufacturing and services, and smaller cuts in agriculture. And then in 2000, trade agreement with the US begins. This was a long negotiation, and the point in which it started depended mostly on the approval of the US Senate. So it was hard to anticipate when it would take place. but you kind of knew what was going to happen because this was a long-term negotiation. And in this case, you see really big cuts in agriculture, but also in manufacturing, service, as well as mining. On the other hand, the tariffs from the US to Colombia, they didn't really change much, as you see in the right panel. And this is mainly because the conditions under which the free trade agreement was signed, basically they kept the tariffs that were already in place given previous agreements between Colombia and the US. So they basically kept their low tariffs to Colombia in exchange of Colombia lowering the tariffs to the US. And the result of this is that Colombia ended up exporting pretty much the same to the US that it was already exporting, which makes sense because tariffs from the US to Colombia didn't really change. But we ended up importing much more from the US than before that. So we're gonna try to follow up the labor market in throughout these reforms. And for this, we're going to use different data sets. We're going to use the trade, the really rich trade data. We basically use the decrees of the Colombian trade ministry and the free trade agreement, and we had to process that basically by hand to follow in each sector. Then we're going to use imports by firm, which are available in Colombia. So this is publicly available data in Colombia. You can see how much each firm, formal firm in the country, is importing. So we're going to use this to build this sort of input-output matrix that is going to allow us to see what is the typical imported input of each sector and industry, and that's gonna help us build this input shock. Then we're going to use administrative data from the Social Security records that provide us a match employer-employee data set for the universal formal employees in Colombia, and we're going to use this as a measure of formal employment. And we're going to combine this with household surveys that are going to give us a bigger picture of the labor market. Remember that in Colombia, approximately half of the labor market is informal, and it's never really going to show up in administrative records. So if you want to take a big picture of the labor market, you have to do both, basically. And it's kind of the same in most Latin American countries, I would say. So our shocks are twofold. The first one is the competition shock, and it's basically the change in tariffs with respect to the tariff that was in place in 2010 for each sector. So for all the goods that are produced in a single sector, basically. And the input shock it's a bit different because it's a weighted sum of the change in the tariffs of all the inputs that a sector imports. So we're going to use this data set in which we have all inputs by firm. And with this, we're going to compute how the share of inputs of each industry from any other industry, right? And with this, we can have a weighted sum of the change in the tariffs. So this is going to basically give us how much the price of inputs change with the reform, given the composition, the sectoral composition of imported inputs of each sector. Okay, once we have these two measures, we're going to use a two-way fixed effect model in which we have a continuous treatment measure. The first one is going to be the change in the tariffs of each sector, and the second one is going to be this weighted sum of the change in the tariffs of the inputs of each sector. We're going to call the input shock. And once we have computed and estimated these two coefficients, we try to somehow aggregate them. So once again, this is not a general equilibrium effect, so we're not really claiming that this is going to be a perfect measure of the aggregate effect, but we would still like to compare them in their magnitude, right? So how much one is offsetting the other, and to do this as a weighted sum, and we're going to use the average shock by sector as the weight, right? So because if you think about it, the competition shock is going to affect more than proportionally agriculture and manufacture. So, but the input shock is mostly going to affect other sectors, is going to affect most sectors in the economy, actually, including services. So, for example, in the services sector, you're gonna see a very small competition shock because very few of these sectors were actually affected by tariffs directly, but you're gonna see a relatively large input shock, right? So the way we do this is that we multiply each of these coefficients by the average shock of these sectors. So as you can see, sectors like services were hardly affected by the competition shock, but they were pretty much affected by the input shock, as opposed to manufacturing which has both, right? So the first set of results is sort of a first stage, and we're basically gonna see the effect on imports. And as you can see, the tariff reduction. This is the total tariff reduction. This is the unilateral 2010 reduction, and this is the free trade agreement. Has a positive and significant effect on imports, and particularly on U.S. imports, right? When you think about the non-U.S. imports, you're only going to see some really small effects here, and nothing when you take the aggregate one. And so this tells us that the country that benefited the most from these reforms, even though the first one applied to every single country in the world, was the US, right? So the big shock that took place during these last 10 years in Colombia in trade was mainly due to imports from the US. And there was no shock on exports. I'm not going to show that for the sake of time, but basically there's no effect whatsoever on exports, and that's basically because the first reform didn't really affect tariffs that affected Colombian goods outside of the Colombia, and the second reform basically kept the tariffs that were already in place before the free trade agreement. So there's no reason to believe that these reforms were going to have an effect on exports. So the motivation of our paper is basically actually these graphs. When you split the sample between sectors that had no tariff reduction and that had tariff reduction in red, you see that employment basically dropped in sectors that had tariff reduction compared to those that didn't. And the opposite happened in the input price reduction. When you think about sectors that did not had any reduction in the inputs prices, you see a big fall in employment, and the opposite happened in the input price reduction. And when you think about earnings, you're not really gonna see that difference. It's really mild compared to what you see in employment, and that's gonna be partially explained by large rigidities in the labor market in Colombia. So let's see the first set of results. This is the effect on employment of the competition shock, the input shock, and both. And what we're going to see throughout the household surveys and the administrative records under these longitudinal columns is negative and significant effects for the competition shock, which is consistent with most of the literature so far, and some positive, although statistically insignificant effects of the input shock. But when you estimate them together, you're going to start seeing some positive and significant effects of the input shock. And when you add these two shocks with the weighted sum that I described earlier, you're going to see no significant effects. The coefficients are sometimes positive, sometimes negatives, but they are statistically insignificant. So overall, we do tend to believe that one effect could be offsetting the other, even though our statistical test for this has to be interpreted with caution, given that there are general equilibrium effects that could be behind these. But in the reduced form estimates, we do find we can say that there are opposite effects of the input shock and the input competition shock, which is rare in the literature and has hardly been proved before in these kinds of papers. When you think about this in the event study version of this estimate, you're going to estimates for tariff reduction, some positive ones for input price reduction. The second result is that there's a large heterogeneity by sector. So here we basically split in three sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services, and estimate the input competition shock, the input shock, and then we add them with this weighted sum as before. And what we see, I'm going to talk about two main results. On the first one is manufacturing. One thing that's really interesting about manufacturing is that you find negative effects for the input shock. And that could seem, it's not exactly the story I was telling you so far. When you take the whole sample, you're finding, you were finding positive effects for inputs and negative for input competition. But in the case of industry, we have very consistent negative effects for inputs. And this could be reflecting some sort of automation, or basically if you were importing actually capital goods that are not complementary to, that are substitutes of cheap labor in manufacturing, you could expect this negative effect. And we have a little theoretical model in which this effect could be ambiguous depending on the complementarity between capital and low-skilled labor. So what seems to be happening with manufacturing is that you're importing more capital goods, and this is substituting low skilled labor. So you have a negative effect that's driven by cheaper inputs, and this is gonna go. It's gonna complement the negative effect that we already have for import competition. So on the net, you're gonna see a negative effect for the manufacturing sector. The opposite tends to happen with the services sector, in which we find some positive effects for inputs, for the input shock, and small and sometimes insignificant effects for the input competition. So when you add them up, you still have some positive and significant effects for the services. So this just gives us some preliminary evidence of what could look like a reallocation between sectors. And just go really fast through the last results. Do you have a question? I see your hand.
Yeah, sorry, it's just to tell you that we have 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. We're good. Thanks. So the third result is that when you take a look at wages, you hardly see any effects except in the informal sector using the household service. And this is consistent with the fact that Colombia has a very segregated labor market, in which you have a formal sector which is very regulated and has a minimum wage that's rather high compared to the minimum wage. So what could be happening here is that most of the workers are already in the minimum wage, and you can't really adjust via prices in these settings, in this setup. Which is not true for the informal sector, which has no floors. So in the informal sector, you could have some adjustment via prices, and this seems to be what's happening here. And most of these effects are driven actually by the foreign input mechanism in this case, which seems consistent to an extent to what we were observing in the manufacturing sector, but in this case, it's basically applied to the whole sample. The fourth set of results is the heterogeneity by skills or education. So we basically use, for this one, we're only using the household service where we can observe for the entire population. Well, for everyone in the survey, we can actually observe the education level, which is not true for the administrative records. So we're just focusing on household service here. And we're going to split the sample between people with a bachelor degree and people with only up to higher education, up to secondary education. So, what we find is that when we think about employment, you're going to see some negative and significant effect of the input competition shocking both skilled and unskilled workers. But it's the foreign input shock is concentrated in the unskilled workers. So these having cheaper inputs only benefits unskilled workers and has no effect on the skilled ones. When you think about earnings, you're going to see that most of the negative earning effects that we were observing in the previous slide and overall is going to be concentrated in skilled workers, which is kind of surprising because we were thinking mostly about the adjustment of this informal sector, but it has to be said that in Colombia you have a lot of educated people also in the informal sector. It's really half of the economy, so there's enough room for them to be informal and high skilled, but still surprising how most of the effect is concentrated in this group of workers. And finally, we build this measure of accessibility, of market accessibility, and it's going to be basically, we're going to use Google Maps and compute the driving distance to the closest port, entry port to the country. This includes airports, well, big international airports, which in which there are some imports of goods, right? Not just any international airport, but international airports with trade offices in the country. And basically this accessibility measure is going to be an inverse of that distance, driving time distance between the capital of each department and the closest entry point to the country for trade. And we are going to estimate the heterogeneous effects by these measures. And what we see is that the competition shock is mostly concentrated in really inaccessible areas. And the closest you get to the ports, the effects tends to vanish. And the opposite tends to happen to the input shock, but really the effect is not really significant in any point. So the negative slope is there, but it's really statistically equal to zero in most points. And the aggregate effect, the sum of these two, the weighted sum of these two effects is very similar to the competition shock, and it's basically be concentrated in the regions that are most isolated in the country. So this is really affecting regions that were beforehand not really involved in international trade, and with all these reforms somehow they got involved, and they had this effect that it could, I like to think of it as a catch-up in a way. This effect maybe took place 10 or 20 years ago in the more connected regions of the country, and the fact that things got cheaper just pushed the effect to the regions that were more isolated in the first place. So some of the key takeaway points: the input competition decreases employment, but the foreign inputs increased it. So we really have to think about this input price effect and the mechanism as a way that can somehow compensate some industries for the loss that is driven by having more competition. We do find some effects of relocation, particularly between manufacturing and services. There's some adjustment via wages, but only in the informal sector, which is consistent with the fact that we have all these rigidities, and we have some important heterogeneous effects as well that should be addressed and further studied before thinking about the winners and the losers of trade in this kind of situation and settings. So thank you very much, and any questions are more than welcome.
Thank you, Leonardo. Any questions? I wanted to ask you whether you have information about imports of capital goods, and whether you have checked if the composition of capital goods imports have changed. I mean, yeah. For example, some less advanced or cheaper capital goods to more about price.
I mean, we do have the rather detailed data on inputs, so we could identify capital goods, but I don't think we can really, we don't have enough information to think about the quality of these goods or the variety of these goods, which is a question that we have had before. And I think it's a key point, right? Because trade is going to give you cheaper goods, but it's going to give you also more variety, and in the particularly when you're talking about capital goods, you're gonna get access to better machines somehow, right? So yeah, but that's a key point. But we goods, they had to know more about the quality of these goods and the kind of of goods that are being classified as capital goods. So yeah, it's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. I have also some references that I will give you in the chat that perhaps are useful for. Any questions? If there are no other questions, please, Arthur, you can begin your presentation.
Thank you very much, everyone, and we can perhaps discuss at the end of the session a bit more about the comments. Okay, thanks.
Great.
So can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Good. So hi everyone, thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm a PhD student at São Paulo School of Economics, and today I'm going to talk about trade shocks and child labor in Brazil. This is a joint work with Marcos Nakaguma. He's also from São Paulo School of Economics. So one widely debated topic in human capital literature is how economic shocks affect child labor and schooling. From a theoretical perspective, these effects are a priori unclear since economic shocks trigger many general equilibrium effects, which eventually affect household decisions. More importantly, the associated income and substitution effects can both increase and reduce child labor. It's not surprising, for example, that the extensive empirical literature on this topic has found mixed results. Many papers find a negative relationship between income shocks and child labor, while several other studies support a positive relationship. So despite the considerable improvements over the past decades, empirically identifying these economic mechanisms has remained a challenge. So in this paper, we try to shed some light on these issues by exploiting local economic shocks brought about Brazil's trade liberalization in the 90s. So between 1990 and 1995, the federal government significantly reduced import tariffs on different products, and this movement towards openness had substantial effects on local economies across the country. So we thus exploited this episode to investigate the medium and long-term effects on schooling and child labor in Brazil. In order to do so, we follow the previous literature and we create a measure of local exposure to the trade reform by exploiting two sources of variation in a shift-share design. So the first variation is the cross-region variation in the initial employment composition, and the second one is the cross-industry variation in the magnitude of tariff declines. However, we still have the challenge of identifying shocks that affect differently the returns to child labor and the returns to adult labor. And this is important because changes in returns to adult labor affect household incomes, making education more or less affordable. So this type of shock is typically associated with the income effects. On the other hand, changes in returns to child labor affect the opportunity costs of schooling. So these shocks are mainly associated with the substitution effects. So to identify these two different effects in our empirical strategy, we exploit the fact that children have comparative advantages in specific industries. And then we create two different exposure measures in our empirical setting. One for adult-specific industries and another one for child-specific industries. So by doing this, we indeed find different patterns for child labor in schooling. Between 1991 and 2000, we find that regions that were specialized in adult-specific industries experienced lower growth in schooling and also slower reductions in child labor. Both effects are relative to the national trend. On the other hand, we find opposite effects when we look at shocks in child-specific industries. Specifically, we observe faster increases in schooling and also higher decreases in child labor. We also document how these shocks affected other educational outcomes. So in particular, we observe persistent effects on human capital formation. In particular, we observe a deterioration in high school dropouts, literacy rate, and average years of schooling in regions largely exposed to shocks on adults. And we also document how these shocks translated into the labor market by showing that there was a reallocation of adult labor between sectors. And this reallocation was quite different depending on the shock that we analyzed. And all these effects that I just described are stronger in the long term. So this paper is related to a broad literature linking economic shocks and human capital investments. It also speaks to the literature on the effects of trade on local labor markets. The most closely related paper to ours is this one from Bei and Wang. In this paper, the authors study the effects of the Indian tariff reform on child labor and schooling. They focus on the agriculture sector, and they use household survey data to identify crops that are either intensive in adult labor or intensive in child labor. The advantage of our strategy, however, is that first, we don't focus only on the agriculture sector. On the contrary, we study shocks that affected the entire economy, especially the manufacturing sector. The second advantage is that we exploit the geographical distribution of working children population across the country. And we do this by using censitary data. So the large samples allow us to obtain more precise estimates that could not be obtained using the typical household surveys. And finally, we contribute to the literature by investigating the long-term trends in child labor. Previous work has mostly focused on short-term trends or cyclical changes. Okay, just to give a brief overview about the institutional background, for decades, Brazil adopted a complex protection system against foreign competition. And not only high levels of nominal tariffs were used to protect the national industry, but also several non-tariff barriers. In 1990, the new elected government unexpectedly announced a reform agenda that started with the replacement of all these non-tariff barriers with higher tariffs with equivalent protection. And between 1999 and 1995, these nominal tariffs were gradually reduced. So as we can see in this graph here, for example, some industries experienced steeper reductions in tariffs than others. So this is the main, one of the main variations that we exploit in our empirical strategy. Regarding the data, our main source of information is the Brazilian demographic census. Our analysis focuses on the period between 1991 and 2010, but we also use data for 1980 to account for pre-existing trends. Our sample of children consists of individuals between 10 and 14 years old. We also include in our sample adults between 15 and 64. When studying child labor and schooling outcomes, we look at the share of children in 4 different activities, which are in school only, work and study, and idle. And we also collect data on earnings and employment status by sector of activity. Our data on tariff come from Cumy, Piano, and Souza. These data are widely used in the literature. And the empirical analysis occurs at the microregion level, which is a group of neighboring municipalities sharing similar characteristics. So we can interpret these microregions as a local labor market. Okay, the first step in our empirical strategy, as I mentioned, is to create a measure of local exposure to the trade reform. And we do this by following the previous work, the papers from Kovac and Dix Carneiro. And our measure of regional exposure is basically a weighted average of tariff changes, with weights representing the importance of each industry in regional employment. So the main intuition is that some regions were more or less exposed to the tariff reform depending on their initial industry specialization. Note that we multiply our weighted average by -1 here. So the idea is to facilitate the interpretation of the results. Therefore, regions that experienced larger tariff cuts also have larger positive values for this measure here. However, this traditional shift share design does not capture shocks that affect differently the returns to adult labor and the returns to adult labor. So we added this dimension of variation by extending the shift to share design, as I mentioned before, exploiting the fact that some industries are more child labor intensive than others. So the main modification that we do in our index is basically multiply our weighted average by these two weights here, which are the share of child workers or the share of adult workers in each industry by region. So by doing this, we break down our aggregate exposure measure into two additive components, one that is specific for child-intensive industries and another one that is specific for adult-intensive industries. And therefore, the former index here captures, or at least is more associated with returns to child labor. We expect to capture substitution effects when analyzing these type shocks in these industries. The second measure, on the other hand, captures is more related to returns to adult labor, and therefore we should be capturing the income effects by looking at this index here. We can see in these maps that we have significant variation, geographic variation in both measures. So even within the same state, we have variation to capture, to identify the effect of these shocks. Sorry, Leonardo, do you have a question? You're muted.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I forgot that.
Okay.
I'll tell you a quick question. So aren't these two measures highly correlated to each other?
If we look the correlation, if we look at the correlation of the overall tariff shock with the segregated tariff shocks, obviously the adult shocks are almost one-to-one correlated. There is a large variation between these two other shocks, but we have enough variation to identify. We have power to identify different effects from these shocks.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, in terms of the empirical strategy, when looking at the labor market outcomes, we use a three-step strategy to filter out composition effects. So the idea here is that in the first step for each census year, we regress at the individual level this following specification here. The outcomes considered are earnings and an indicator for whether the individual is employed or not. And we are interested in these coefficients here, this theta, that captures the average earnings and the average employment rate at the regional level, net of observable worker composition. We do this we use this coefficient, these estimated coefficients in our second step to construct our dependent variables at the microregion level. So our main specification at the microregion level is this one here, in which we control for state fixed effects. And this is important because many policies in Brazil are defined at the state level. And we also include a vector of demographic controls. But our main goal is to investigate the different effects in returns to adult labor and the returns to child labor. So we basically replace this delta tariff here with the two disaggregated tariff measures that we create for child and adults. It's important to note that when studying child labor, child activities, and other educational outcomes, we don't do this three-step procedure. We only do this when looking at the labor market outcomes. The identification relies on the assumption that unobserved specific shocks that affect both schooling and labor market outcomes are uncorrelated with the tariff changes. In the paper, we show a series of robustness exercises to check the validity of our results, and our main conclusions remain the same for all these different empirical exercises here. Let me skip and go straight to the results. So I'm starting by discussing, I'll start by discussing the results for child labor and schooling. The first thing that we observe here is that regions that are specialized in adult-specific shocks observed lower growth in schooling, both in the medium term and the long term. So we can see by looking at these two coefficients here. On the other hand, we observe opposite effects on child labor, and the share of children working relatively increase in these regions, and this increase were especially important in the share of children who work in paid employment. So this result suggests that children living in these regions left school to engage in labor activities to help or to improve household incomes. On the other hand, when we look at the regions that were specialized in child-intensive industries, we observe opposite effects. So school attendance increased faster in these regions, and child labor decreased faster, especially for those children who both work and study. These are the vast majority of children who works in Brazil. And again, the results, at least the results in child labor, are driven by those children who work in paid employments. Okay, so overall, what this putting together, what this result suggests is that the trade reform had substantial effects, substantially stronger and heterogeneous effects on child labor and schooling in Brazil. And these effects were very persistent through time. Next, to further understanding these effects on schooling, we study the dynamic of the dynamic effects on school enrollment, and we do this by exploiting the school census data. So each point in this graph represents an individual regression, and what we observe is basically that it's the same pattern that I've just described. So regions that were specialized in children-specific industries, we observe faster increases in school enrollment, and on the other hand, shocks on adults are associated with relative decreases in school enrollment. However, we should interpret these results with caution because the first available year, the first available data for school census is in 1995, which is the last year of the trade reform. So we have to use this year as the reference period, and we are not able to test for pretrends using this data here. The second problem with this data is that in 2006, school census changed its data collection methodology. So the database is pretty different pre and post 2006. But overall, what we can conclude looking all these results is that the effects on schooling were quite strong and persistent. Next, we try to understand whether other educational outcomes were also affected by the trade reform. So we look at three different outcomes that are changes. Those are the changes in high school dropouts, changes in literacy rate, and the average years of schooling. And what we observe here is that regions affected by shocks on adults experienced a relative deterioration in all of these indicators, which is consistent to the previous results when we look at the share of children in school. But we don't find any statistically significant effect for the shocks on child, except for this coefficient here, which goes in the opposite direction that we expect. This is something that we should investigate a little bit further, but I suspect that there's something related here with collinearity with the controls that we use in our regressions. Some of the controls are correlated with the shock. When we drop out all the controls, the results are much more intuitive. So these effects here are positive and significant. This negative effect disappears, and we also find positive results for average years of schooling. So, but overall, these results helps us to better understand the impacts on human capital formation. And finally, the last set of results that I'd like to show you is whether these educational effects were transmitted to the labor market. So we would expect that in regions positively affected in terms of education, we should observe adults getting better labor market opportunities, better opportunities in labor market. So what we find is similar results that goes in this direction. So for adult-specific shocks, we observe relative decreases in formal employment and also a shift from manufacturing industries towards non-tradable and agricultural sectors. This set of results is well documented in the literature. What is new here is the effects for shocks on children. We observed that these regions observed relative increases in formal employment and a shift of the adult labor employment towards manufacturing. So the idea is that the higher levels of schooling maybe allowed individuals to explore more high skill or more skill intensive economic activities. So to conclude, the main takeaway of this paper is that the trade reform in Brazil had substantial effects on child labor and schooling. All these effects are stronger, are economically meaningful, and very persistent through time. The reform also had implications for the labor markets, and most importantly, the effects were quite heterogeneous depending on the shock that we analyze or depending on the set of industries that were affected by the reform. And for policymakers, the main takeaway is that when formulating public policies, these local economic contexts should be taken into account when formulating public policies. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the great presentation. Any questions? I was wondering also whether you have any data or you can control or for any monitoring that can, for example, informality or child labor can have in each region. Can this be a confounder in any way? Perhaps you think that this is not different between regions, but my question was whether this effect of, for example, less monitoring in some regions can interact with shocks.
Well, we do some robustness exercise, I think not exactly in this direction, but we control for other potential confounders. For example, we control for the share of urbanization rate or for the share of the local government spending on educations. We also control for the level of the child labor in 1980 to account for possible mean reversal effect. We also try to investigate if there are any how can I say, any effect on the school infrastructure. So I think that at least in parts, we account for this potential correlation that could be confounding our results. I don't know if I
Yes.
So I have a question regarding but when I think about child labor in Colombia, you would usually want to talk about the enforcement of the child labor policies. Because what was happening in this kind of country is that they identified some sectors that were really intensive in child labor. And this was an International Labor Organization policy. And they would target these sectors specifically to try to eradicate child labor in some very specific industries. So my question is, are you able to do that? Perhaps is there any way you can measure some child labor eradication policies that be confounding your effects in some of these really child labor intensive sectors before, that were really intensive in your baseline measure, and you're actually using that to measure these heterogeneous effects? But this could also be some time varying confounding, because they were identified by this policy. They were probably looking for kids working in these sectors. And I don't know if this could be something you could disentangle from your results, because I think it would be a threat to your identification.
Yeah, you're completely right. I think that is something really important to do. I don't know if this could help, but I think I could exploit some labor inspections in Brazil. There is a paper from Gabriel Liceia and Vladimir Ponchek, in which they look at these labor market inspections to investigate whether the firms were complaining to the labor market rules. And I don't know, maybe by exploiting this type of variation, which probably is very specific to some types of industries, I could do something in the direction that you are saying. But it's really, really important to do. Thank you for the suggestion.
You should probably try to look also at the worst form of child labor in Brazil. I think that's the name they gave it in other countries. And they basically highlighted these sectors in which child labor was a big deal in each country. And so that could give you perhaps some, some variation, because some of these sectors that you identify as very child labor intensive may have been identified in the worst form of child labor category, and others didn't. Okay. So that will give you some variation regarding these kinds of sector-specific policies. That, I think at least you should try to talk about these policies and, somehow prove that this is not driving your results, right? So.
Okay. No, that's an excellent idea. Thank you very much, Leonardo.
Mm-hmm. It's a really nice paper, by the way. I should always begin by saying that, but it's really good paper.
Thank you. Your papers are well too. Very nice.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you for your presentation. I will have to present quickly my paper with Martín González Rosada. And in this paper, what we want to do is we want to analyze the effect of trade agreements on labor share for Latin American countries. So our main point is that the evolution of the labor share has been falling in the beginning of the 2000s for the Latin American countries as a whole, but that this effect is very heterogeneous. At the same time, in the same period, there has been a strong trade openness, as we have emphasized before. First, by unilateral reduction in tariffs and unilateral liberalization, but also by signing trade agreements with other economies. Particularly interesting are trade agreements with big economies, because this is a sharp shock that could affect the economy a lot, because it is a trade agreement that could have a strong effect on trade and on the composition of income, of production, and can have a strong effect on labor share also. What we do in this paper is we analyze these trade agreements with big economies signed after the 90s as case studies to evaluate the effect of trade agreements and trade in general on labor share using synthetic control methods. So in particular, we consider the untreated countries of Latin America as possible controls. We apply synthetic control methods to each case study and find strong negative effects on labor share. We also aggregate the effects by using a single model and find an aggregate and average effect between 2 and 4 percentage points 4 years after trade agreement. When we analyze the robustness check, the robustness of our results, when we change methods, variables, and countries considered, we also find almost the same effect, about 2 to 4 percentage points of negative effect of trade agreements after 4 years. About the mechanisms, we find that also manufacturing exports and manufacturing in general as proportion of GDP has increased in these countries. And also that, again, increased compared to the counterfactuals, and also real wages have decreased in these treated countries. So what we find is that there is compositional effect, but also additional effects on real wages that were affected by these trade agreements in a significant and substantial way. The issue that we want to emphasize is related to labor share and effects of trade and custom unions using synthetic control methods. These are the papers that we mostly are more related to our work. And also related to labor share, Carver Bonis, Neyman, and others have proposed several hypotheses about the reduction in labor share in time. And we also draw from other trade and labor market effects literature. In particular, these two references are important for the input effects on the labor share in general and on other outcomes. So what I want to do is I want to present the methods very briefly, the data and some results to go through them through the mechanisms and conclude. So the synthetic control method for case study assumes that there is one country that is treated, one unit that is treated, and J units that can be used as control units. It assumes that the potential outcome of the non-treated case is directly affected by common factors, which are delta T, fixed effects by time that are common to all units, theta T, and lambda T, common factors to all units, and factor loadings that are particular to the country, which are ZY and mu Y. ZY are observable variables, while mu I are not observable. Finally, there is a transitory shock with zero mu. The effect in this method would be the difference between, for the treated units, the difference between the potential outcome of being treated minus being not treated for all periods after the treatment. The challenge is, of course, to have some estimation of this counterfactor. For that, let's consider a vector of weights that satisfies these conditions. These weights can reproduce the pre-treatment evolution of the outcome variable of the treated unit, and also the explanatory variables, or in particular the factor loadings Z of the treated units, by combining all the donor pools, all the countries or the units in the donor pool. In such a case, then it can be shown that the difference between the outcome variable in the treated unit minus the weighted average of the donor pool would be a good estimator for the effect of this treatment. So the challenge is now how to compute these weights. For that, we follow the nested algorithm that minimizes the difference between the explanatory variables or pre-treatment variables, comparing the treated units with the potential donor pool weighted by these weights, So we set the weights that minimize these differences. Where in these explanatory variables, we include the Z variables that I have already explained, and also some average of some periods of the outcome variable in pre-treatment periods. So with this nested algorithm, we get these weights, and we can compare or generate the gap in the labor share that would be the effect of this intervention. And we then go through the inference, because with a synthetic control, we have a challenge that, that is to generate inference, because for each period, we observe only one number. So for inference, we implement permutations. That is, we implement synthetic control method to every country in a donor pool, so to every untreated country, and collect these gaps of the labor share, of the outcome variable, and we have to compare the distribution of these gaps to the ones that are our case studies. To provide an aggregate effect, and also to provide or to use these permutations, we implement regressions. In particular, we implement difference in difference equations, as in this first equation, and also an even study difference in difference equation, as in this second equation. So in these two types of equations, we are using the permutations as well as our case studies. In this second equation, we can introduce also some controls to control or analyze particular effects related to our treatment. Our case studies are Latin American countries that signed trade agreements with the European Union, United States, and China. In the case we have, as in the case in Chile, we have 3 years. We take the first as the treatment period. And we use then Chile, Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, Peru, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama as our case studies. These other cases, we didn't find enough data to use them as case studies. We use data from the Penn-Ward tables. We also use data from Karl Burns and Neyman, in this case, the total labor share and corporate labor share. And we use the work development indicators for variables about trade and the composition of labor. These are some of our variables, and I will go through the some results related to our data. So in the panel A, we plot the evolution of labor share for the world in these dashed green lines, and for Latin America. And we observe that while for the world there is a reduction of labor share of about 6 percentage points, in Latin America there is a reduction only after 2000s, in the beginning of the 2000s, but then it recomposed, labor share increased again. But this evolution is very different between countries, and in particular, when we divide countries according to whether they signed a labor share with a big economy, we find that those that signed a trade agreement with the economy, we find that they drop in the labor share by 5 points or 4 points, sorry, while the other countries increased labor share. So trade seems to be an important mechanism, but in this case, we only have suggestive evidence. We use then our method, synthetic control, to estimate the causal effects. So we apply then synthetic control methods to each case study using Latin American countries as possible controls. The countries that are possible controls are not affected by a trade agreement with the economies. Each specification, so each selection of explanatory variables, was set to minimize the root mean square prediction error of pretreatment period in each case. What we do is we now show the individual case study results, and then we show some aggregate results for each case. So we have in the first panel, Chile, where we observe that the result is that labor share dropped substantially, like 10 percentage points, after the trade agreement. And the synthetic Chile, which is the dashed line, increased labor share after that same period. So the difference between the two lines is interpreted as the effect of trade agreement. The same or something in the like we observe for Guatemala, Mexico, and Panama, and also for Peru. The difference is that for Peru, the evolution of the labor share is somewhat constant, and what is increasing is the counterfactual Peru, while for Colombia, Honduras, and Nicaragua, we observe no effect or not substantial effect in labor share. But for Chile, Guatemala, Mexico, and Panama, we observe a strong negative effect. What we can do is now we can aggregate these effects using not only these case studies, but also the placebos generated for each case study, and provide some results in a regression fashion. So we use or we implement this difference in difference equation, and we estimate it or we interpret it as a triple difference result, because we apply difference in difference equations to a gap, and we find that in Chile, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, and Peru, we find a negative and substantial and significant effect, about 5 percentage points in each case. For Colombia, Honduras, Nicaragua, we don't observe any effect or any significant effect. Yes, Leonardo.
So just make sure I understand the method. So because up to this point, you were doing something really close to Abadier, right? In the synthetic control method.
Yeah.
Except you have multiple treated, but that's
Yes.
right. But for each possible treated, you estimate all the placebo regressions for all the countries in the journal.
Yes.
And then you estimate the effect for each of these, and this is what you use in this new regression.
We use all the panel of all treated and placebos, and with the panel we apply this for each case study. We apply this equation.
But it's the in this panel, what you're gonna have is the y minus y star.
Yeah.
Of each country, right? So if you have, I don't know, 20 countries plus 1, you're gonna have 21 observations in this panel. Is that right?
Yes.
Thanks, I get it.
At the same time, we want to give an aggregate effect, adding up all these case studies. And for that purpose, what we do is we can apply the same method, but in this case, we now implement the same model for countries. The same model means the same variables. So with respect to a single specification for every case study, we identify the explanatory variables, but minimize the mean square prediction error of the post-intervention period among all placebos. So this is the method that we use to identify these explanatory variables. We identify as the log of GDP per capita, capital output ratio, years of schooling, TFP, average outcome, and the average outcome in the 3 periods pre-intervention as the explanatory variable. And we also team in the outcome variable as the Y. Then we report our results using regressions, event study regressions and event study indifference. And this is the result. When we apply this method to placebos, we find that there is no change, no gap, so that placebos have on average 0 gap in all periods. While for the treated units, we find 0 gap before the treatment, and after the treatment, we observe a negative effect that reaches a -3 percentage points after 4 years of the intervention. This is the result of this same method, in this case related to difference in difference, where we observe after 4 years of intervention the significant effect or marginally significant of 3 percentage points, 5 percentage points, in the case we use some fixed effects. When we restrict the the placebo exercise to those that have, or we eliminate those that have a really high root mean square prediction error. And we get those that generate a better synthetic control. Then we get, again, 3 percentage points and somewhat smaller standard errors. And the same when we include some controls. So let's go for some mechanisms. I'm running out of time, so I will go quickly through a couple of results. Now we apply the same method to other outcome variables. So we are trying to see whether this effect can come from the effects of trade agreements on, for example, exports and the composition of production. And we find that the effect is positive on exports, in particular on manufacturing exports, and on the composition of GDP, where the industry increased by 3 percentage points, almost 4 percentage points, the composition of GDP. So this is talking about that the composition of GDP can be affecting by itself, just by composition effects, the labor share, because industry or manufacturing in particular has a lower labor share. So by these composition effects, we can observe a fall in labor share by itself. We also analyzed whether other things can be explaining this fall in labor share, and we analyzed investment price. We observed that investment price increased, but this is not related to higher investments in our sample. So we are not relating our results with the proposal by Caraballo-Lorenz and Neyman that this is a change in capital labor share because of the fall in price of investment. This is not the case, at least in our case. When we try to decompose the change in the labor share by effects on labor, on prices, on labor income, on GDP, and on prices of GDP, we find that almost all the effect in labor share, which is here in log points, so it is the same number as before, but applied to the log of labor share, we find that all the effect is related to a fall in the real labor income, and not because of a fall in labor or a change in labor productivity or changes in prices. It is only through changes in real wages. When we, in real labor income, sorry. When we further decompose the labor share, including which part is related to wages and which part is related to labor income of the independent workers, we observe that the fall is mostly related to wages and nothing related to labor income of independent workers. Finally, we include in our results some covariates, trying to control for any other effects that could affect our results or could, in fact, be confounders of our results. In this case, we use mineral rents, and we find that including mineral rents can reduce the effect that we observe or we estimate, but is not the main driver of these results. In this case, we are trying to control for the prices in copper, for example, in the case of Chile or in the case of Peru. The same with export prices. We don't observe any change when we control for export prices in our results. And when we include the composition of GDP, like by using industry over GDP or by using industry services and government, we observe that the effect is reduced, but again is significant and negative. The same when we control for employment. So just to finish, I have many robustness that I can show you, but I go to the conclusions. So trade agreement seems to have a negative impact on the labor share between 2 to 4 percentage points on average, draws to different specifications. Effects are heterogeneous. They are negative for Chile, Guatemala, Mexico, and Panama. They are not significant or not robust for Colombia, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Peru. Post-intervention evolution of price of exports, Miller rents, cyclical effects do not explain this drop in labor share. Changes in the composition of GDP can explain about 1 percentage point of the drop. So we'll include this composition by industry and services. And there is a stagnant labor income after trade agreements in most of the case studies. And this is what is more related to the fall in labor share. So thank you for your attention, and I'm available for questions.
So this is a really interesting paper. I have a, it's raining. Okay, so I have a couple of questions regarding the methods. So the first one is, I wonder why you didn't use a more standard, event study approach, and you went on with the synthetic control method to begin with. So that's something that I think, from what I've seen, I've been kind of reading on this method lately, and from what I've seen, people really have to justify why they are using this instead of more standard approach. So that's the first question. And the second one is, this is the first time I see this like 2 steps approach, right? So you estimate the synthetic control for each treated, and then you put this in the second estimation, which is really interesting. I haven't seen that before. There's some new literature, I think, that estimates all that simultaneously. So there's this new paper by Stanford people, Susanati, Benz, and friends. It's called Synthetic Difference in Difference, that might actually merge this whole thing in a single estimation. But I've been studying this, but I haven't got to these new papers in synthetic control. So it's more out of curiosity. Is this your making, or this is a common thing in the synthetic control method, like having this 2-step estimation?
Okay. I think that the synthetic control in this case is more reasonable because rather than a single regression with the raw data, because it implements a kind of matching with the available controls, selecting or imposing more weights for those that highly relates to the pre-evolution of the outcome variable, or for the pre-trends in fact. And I think that this is the strong thing about synthetic control. It is really intuitive in our case to implement those methods, and we can then argue in this way. About the combination of the synthetic controls and regressions, we have followed in this case some of the literature, in fact, that does exactly that. In particular, that implemented this difference in difference equation and analyzing it as a triple difference. And we implemented the other one, the one meaning all the pool of all case studies and placebos using difference in difference event study equations. But it is a simple extension. So we draw from the literature the main points. There are other ways to generate these results, or these aggregate results, and the same these effects. But we found this method particularly appealing because we can implement them in an intuitive way, and we can, as far as I'm concerned, explain them better, let's say. But there are other methods that we have implemented, and the results are even larger compared to ours. And in particular, they are more significant also. In particular, we used the paper by Cavallo, Tagliani, and others. That also pull a set of treated units and implements our kind of strategy for inference. So to perhaps answer your question in an indirect way, we have followed the literature anyway, but we have implemented the combination of methods that were most clear for us to also present the results.
Okay, thank you. Congrats, really interesting paper.
Thank you.
Nice paper, Hernan.
Thank you.
Just a question. I thought your result about the decline in real wages kind of intriguing. So I was wondering what is the story? So the story is about changes in the migration of labor between sectors or something like that. And another question is whether you try to look at TFP or something related to productivity as well.
Yes, we found no effect on productivity in these first years. So we kind of bet that trade agreements and trade in general will increase TFP and productivity. We don't find any effects in these first years. And about wages, what we observe is that there is no change, for example, or no significant change in informality in the composition of employment in our ways. And we think that is the composition of production more rather than changes in employment themselves. Because in this case, and this is a negative part, I'm also relating to the question by Leonardo, the negative part of using these aggregate results is that we cannot go for very heterogeneous variables because we have the aggregates only. But what we observe is that wages go down, and minimum wages, for example, is a much less used tool in these countries compared to others. So we think that the country has like a commitment to openness and provides more and to provide more competitive atmospheres to their firms, and for that reason they, for example, they don't use the minimum wage so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Just one last quick question. I don't know if I missed it, but did you estimate the effect on the GDP? Like the size of the cake instead of the share?
Yes, and there is no substantial effect or significant effect. Okay. This is very, I mean, it's 1 percentage point in the log GDP, but it's not significant. And the same, of course, with employment, so there is no gain in labor productivity.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I think that, you know, when you're selling the paper, that should be one of the punchlines.
Okay.
There might not be a big effect on the cake, but it's a distributional effect.
Yeah. Perhaps these are the effects in the first part, I mean, in the first years after the shock. We hope that this is not the case after that the TFP should increase. I mean, this is what also the literature emphasizes, but this is perhaps relocation in production, relocation in other sectors is what we have at first. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for your comments. I think we have to close the session because in a few minutes we have a novel lecture. So it has been a great session. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Same for you. Good luck.
Bye-bye.
Bye.